So in 2012, I ran for Congress. I ran against John Tierney, who at the time was an 8-term congressman, Richard Desai, who had been 20 years in the Massachusetts State House. It was a campaign filled with incredible animosity. But I found very quickly that I was running to the fear factor. A lot of Democrats told me that they didn't want to vote for John Tierney because of the scandals that he had had. And a lot of people told me they didn't want to vote for Richard Desai. I was much more fiscally conservative than Richard Desai. The margin of victory was about 4,000 votes, and I got about 17,000 votes in the election. And so I was given the great title of spoiler. You know, the only spoiled vote is one that's cast for an idea that you don't believe in. And if you're voting for a Republican that you don't like, or you're voting for a Democrat that you don't like because you're afraid of what the other person represents, that's a spoiled vote, and it's a spoiled election.
Actually, what's happened is American politics have become more complicated because of the rise of political independents who don't want to affiliate with either party, and also the rise of libertarians and Greens and other parties. When you've got multiple choices and you've got lots of independents, you wind up with winners who win with 38% of the vote, 43% of the vote. In a lot of people's eyes, that undermines the legitimacy of the candidate who, quote, wins. I mean, in the presidential election, 1/3 of Donald Trump's electoral votes and 1/3 of Hillary Clinton's electoral votes came from states where they did not win the majority. So they won with 48% or 47%. It doesn't feel like it's really legit.
That's not good for democracy. We want a lot of people running for office, and we want voters to have a lot of choice. Ranked choice voting is one of the systems that attempts to solve that issue.
What ranked choice voting does for people is it gives you a resolution with a candidate who finally wins more than 50% of the vote. And at the moment, you've got a lot of elections where that's not going on.
Another thing that's great about ranked choice voting is the campaigns become a lot less hostile. And that's an important thing, because talking about the things that brings us together is a much better way of winning an election than talking about the things that separate us.
So what is ranked choice voting? And how can it possibly make our elections less hostile? First, unlike traditional voting, ranked choice voting requires a winning candidate get a majority of 50% plus 1. Currently, 10 states have elections that require a majority winner. But in 9 of those states, when no one gets a majority, the 2 top candidates square off in a runoff election held weeks later. Not surprisingly, the second runoff election often has less voter turnout than the original. Ranked choice voting solves that problem by allowing voters to rank their preferences of candidates, first, second, third, and so on. The first choice votes are all counted, and if one candidate receives a 50% plus 1 majority, they win, just like any election. But if there is no majority, an instant runoff election occurs. The candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated, and the voters who ranked that candidate as their first choice will have their next choice counted. This continues until one candidate receives a majority and wins. Proponents contend that ranked choice voting can make elections less hostile by changing the dynamics of modern campaigning, from polarizing campaigns of today to ones that encourage coalition building and consensus. Major candidates would no longer be able to rely on firing up their base while demonizing their opponents. Instead, they need to appeal to supporters of other candidates in order to win a majority. But changing the way people vote is bound to create confusion. And can ranked choice voting really make elections less hostile? To find out, we went to Maine, where in 2018 ranked choice voting was used for the first time in both state and federal elections.
For anyone interested in watching history being made, they can come right here to the Elkins Building in Augusta to see the ranked choice process in action.
So I'll tell you, based on the reporting that we know from talking to election officials, town clerks who largely handled ballots in Maine, and the local election officials, they didn't have a lot of problems with people understanding how ranked choice voting worked. You heard from voters going in saying, oh, I don't know, I'm not sure about this, I don't know. And then after they actually tried it, the reaction was,
It was easy, and I thought it was laid out nicely on the ballot, so it was easy to follow. And yeah, it was. I mean, it's a little bit different than what we're accustomed to, but it was very easy to do.
It's very easy if you read the instructions. There's no problem with it at all. You have to kind of know the concept of first, second, third, fourth choices.
Well, it went fine. I understood the process and I understand the mathematics behind it. So to me, it makes sense.
It was kind of just slightly more complicated, but really, really pretty easy.
Well, I like being able to support more than one candidate. I think I will be invested in the outcome more.
Part of the controversy over ranked choice voting being used for the first time was just that. People in general have a hard time making certain kinds of changes.
You know, I think that it's worked for how many years, a couple of 100 years, the way it was, and I don't see any reason to change it.
These views were confirmed in a poll of Maine voters, who overwhelmingly felt ranked choice voting was easy. And even a greater number of voters felt it was important that candidates receive a majority of voter support. But did ranked choice voting make elections less hostile? Maine's second congressional seat was ground zero for the fight to control Congress. It attracted a record-breaking $30 million in spending, mostly by outside groups running negative ads.
The outside groups, most often they don't come in and spend in a positive way. And so everybody just kind of went back to their tried and true playbook, which was, you know, in a close race, at the end of the day, we're going to go negative and attack our opponent.
So as long as special interest groups spend millions of dollars creating fear-based ads on an assembly line, campaigns will still be negative. But even in this toxic environment, ranked choice voting did nurture coalition building.
Eric Brakey, who was running for Senate in Maine, came to the Libertarian Convention and asked Libertarians for their second place vote. And he talked about all the ways that they and he aligned.
And then there was this ad.
Hello, I'm Mark Eaves.
And I'm Betsy Sweet. And in this upcoming governor's race, we are competitors, but we have been longtime allies.
It was probably the most positive ad that we saw throughout the entire election cycle.
The good thing is, and the lucky part is, we have ranked choice voting. So you get to vote for all 7 Democratic candidates.
Well, I've been covering politics for over 20 years, but I don't think I've ever seen that. I've never seen that, mainly because I've never covered a ranked choice election before.
So on June 12th, you can vote for me first and Betsy second,
or me first and him second.
I think it makes perfect sense because you had candidates that were supporting each other that were relatively philosophically aligned anyway.
For the most part, ranked choice voting had little impact on the final election results in Maine. Of the 11 elections eligible to use it, only 3 required an instant runoff to determine the majority winner. And of those 3, 1 election resulted in the candidate who led after the first round losing in the runoff. But that election was the 2nd Congressional District, one of a handful of contests that decided the control of Congress. So it sparked a partisan backlash against ranked choice voting, ignoring the reality that both major parties will be equally impacted when elections become unspoiled.
I do not believe, and I've seen no research or evidence or any conclusions I've reached from looking at any of the places that have any experience using ranked choice voting. I see no evidence at all that shows that it favors one political party or one, say, ideological branch over another. That this is not something set out to undermine the Republican Party, the Democratic Party, the Green Party, the Libertarian Party. If anything, it creates a more competitive process by where any of those parties are going to have a greater incentive to thrive because they're going to have to reach out to a broader base of people and expand potentially their own party ranks.
I think the new dynamic is going to be trying to figure out how you build your strong base of support, but yet have an appeal with voters who may not be thinking of you as their first choice. The extremes of politics on either side are always going to be there. I think what we can hope for in ranked choice voting is that instead of the fringes controlling the system, we have the vast majority of people who are more in the middle controlling the system.
So hopefully it's a little more of a unifying vote than divisive.
So I just like the idea that it might result in candidates that are perhaps more acceptable to broader groups of people.
With confidence, vote for your third party choice, and then maybe your second choice is the major party's candidate, and then we would end up with I think more representation and more people being happy with their choice.
It's easy. I don't know why people are making such a big deal about it. I think what's going to be the issue is we maybe not know as soon as the other way, might slow the process down. But I can wait for democracy. I can wait.
I think we should be open to trying new things to see if we can really get a true representation and get back to even just a better representation of the people.